This is World Solution Writing Process Podcast, Episode 10, continuing to explore the dungeon of my unfinished book. This topic will be why regime change, and I will go back and revisit older topics. But let's just dive into it. So Gene Sharp's From Dictatorship to Democracy is a grassroots DIY regime change toolkit, as opposed to the top-down regime change toolkit that is Edward Luttwak's Coup d'etat, a practical handbook. I'm going to quote Amedeo Bordiga, an Italian Marxist, active most significantly in the 1920s, but also other times. Amedeo Bordiga, in his article, Seize Power or Seize the Factory. He says, "It is rumored that factory councils, where they were in existence, functioned by taking over the management of the workshops and carrying on the work. We would not like the working masses to get hold of the idea that all they need to do to take over the factories and get rid of the capitalists is to set up councils. This would indeed be a dangerous illusion. The factory will be conquered by the working class, and not only by the workforce employed in it, which would be too weak and non-communist, only after the working class as a whole has seized political power. Unless it has done so, the royal guards, military police, etc., in other words, the mechanism of force and oppression that the bourgeoisie has at its disposal, its political power apparatus, will see to it that all illusions are dispelled. It would be better if these endless and useless adventures that are daily exhausting the working masses were all channeled, merged, and organized into one great comprehensive upsurge aimed directly at the heart of the enemy bourgeoisie. Only a communist party should and would be able to carry out such an undertaking. At this time, such a party should and would have no other task than that of directing all its activity toward making the working masses increasingly conscious of the need for this grand political attack, the only more or less direct route to the takeover of the factory, which, if any other route is taken, may never fall into their hands at all." Brutal. More where that came from. So, in The Origins of Bolshevism, a book, the Menshevik leader Fyodor Dan was quoted as saying, and this quote was repeated in Tony Cliff's biography of Lenin, he said, "It is worth noting that later on, almost all of the most eminent of the working class social democrats of this first call-up, who lived to see the 1905 and 1917 revolutions, including Babushkin, Shulginov, Shapoval, Poletayev, and others," I don't know who those people are, I'm just quoting. Back to the quote, "They turned up in the ranks of the Bolsheviks, those who were in 1905 and 1917 revolutions, while out of the ranks of the worker intelligentsia baptized in the strike movement in the second half of the 1890s, there emerged those future cadres of the legal and semi-legal trade unions, cooperatives, cultural enlightenment, etc., workers' movement that for a long time were the chief supporters of Menshevism," which essentially became the reformist faction in the Russian Revolution. To give a little context, basically he's saying the people who were closest to concrete activity ended up being the worst radicals, and the people who were most distant from it, who were more focused on theory and building underground institutional logistics and infrastructure, they ended up being the best radicals when push came to shove. And this is echoed by Bordiga in his article Activism, that those most distant from practical work ended up being the best radicals. He says, "All the activist psalms end in electoral glory. Back in 1917, we saw the sordid conclusion of the superactivism of social democracy. After decades of activity entirely devoted to the conquest of parliamentary seats, of mixed trade union commissions, and of political influence that had bathed them in an aura of unstoppable activism. When the time came for the armed insurrection against capitalism, however, it was seen that the only party to engage in that insurrection was the party that had the least experience, quote, working among the masses, unquote, during the years of preparation, the one that more than any other had worked to preserve Marxist theory. It was then seen that those who possessed a solid theoretical training marched against the class enemy, while those who had a, quote, glorious, unquote, patrimony of struggles shamefully choked on their own words and went over to the side of the enemy." That's the end of the Bordiga quote. So in some ways he's talking about the split between the Second and Third International, where German social democracy sold out. And I think it's important to raise the critique that the main issue with German social democracy was not that it voted for war credits, though that was bad. The main issue with German social democracy is how invested it was in reform struggles. Basically, how invested it was in getting seats in parliament caused it to basically sell out. And when push came to shove with the revolution, they were on the wrong side. I think part of the point that Bordiga is also making that's very important is all the activist psalms end in electoral glory. That's a psalm, like a religious psalm, a religious song. The problem is that the more you get invested in quote-unquote concrete work, demanding immediate change, the more it actually pulls you toward reformism. The more you struggle for reforms, the more it pulls you toward reformism. And this is a difficult thing that I think a lot of people are struggling with right now, because Democratic Socialists of America is very popular. They're very focused on labor work, reform struggles, election work, the very things that Bordiga is criticizing. And the contention is that the more you focus on this quote-unquote concrete, like lowering your demands to what is quote realistic, the more you will get invested in electoralism. And the more you get invested in electoralism, the more you end up playing a counter-revolutionary rather than revolutionary role. And to some people, this is obvious, and it's just a restatement of Lenin's position. If anything, that's precisely my point. Am I a Leninist? I don't know, but I seem to agree with him on an awful lot. So to keep it moving, I'm gonna keep pushing through my notes. I have 100 pages of notes under the topic why regime change. Okay, yeah, furthermore, on activism, Bordiga says, in such conditions of theoretical disorientation, is the labor of restoring Marxism against opportunist distortions merely a theoretical task? No, it is the substantial and committed active struggle against the class enemy. And you may think, well, isn't it more concrete to be in the labor union or to organize a protest or to knock on doors for some progressive candidate? The answer is a lot of time no. The concrete struggle is me having to have this exhausting conversation with the people who are skeptical of it, critiquing reformism and demonstrating all the ways that an orientation toward reform, even by revolutionaries, pulls them into reformism. An orientation towards reform struggles pulls you into electoralism. An orientation towards electoralism pulls you into reformism. The abandonment of revolution. And in practice, that means the abandonment of socialism, as I think Lenin clarified elsewhere, but I don't have it spelled out or quoted. So, at this point, global capitalism is obstructing even basic common sense measures, like universal health care in the United States or decarbonizing the economy. It's very easy to feel like you're making an impact when you're not, and vice versa. It's very easy to get emotionally invested in your movement work, labor work, community organizing, which I think is another part of the treadmill. People say, oh, base building is different because it's not demanding, it's not invested in the state, but it's still demanding concessions other than change of government and transformation of the economy, total transformation of the economy, or at least overall transformation of the economy. It's easy to get involved in all your movement work, labor work, community organizing, protest art, etc., without realizing that many of these activities are just treadmills that create the illusion of forward motion, while meanwhile, nothing really changes, or more realistically, things continue to get worse. Most activism faces the same critique as most charity. Yes, you're helping, but this individualized and limited form of help will always be inundated by the greater and ever-growing systemic harm, so we have to budget more of our energy to bringing down the system directly than to reform movements. Who would we be if we did not stop to criticize the international Marxist tendency, perennial mainstay of being the most sane of the rabid overall political tendency that is Orthodox Trotskyism, even though they deny such a thing as Orthodox Trotskyism exists, while it absolutely does and they belong to it. Here we critique them not politically, but strategically, their policy of a labor party or a third party, possibly a socialist party. For all their clamoring about materialism versus idealism, they can't see the crushing idealism of their third-partyist denial of two vergers law. This is the sociological law which demonstrates no society using a first-past-the-post electoral system, which is what the USA and much of the world still uses, especially with single-member representation, is ever capable of anything but a two-party system. Furthermore, they deny the history, that there has not been any change in the U.S. party system, no replacements of one of the two main parties with a new party since the implementation of the Australia ballot in 1888, which centralizes the electoral process through a capitalist-controlled bureaucracy, instead of letting candidates make and distribute their own ballots. Furthermore, the third partyists ignore the way that, with industrialization and population growth, elections have become a mass turnout operation, requiring funding beyond the reach of ordinary people. Building a third party should be abandoned and replaced with building a parallel government. However, it's still possible that some dissenting party, like the U.S. Green Party, which at least professes to be socialist, could be convinced to participate in a parallel government, or even to form itself into one, possibly while maintaining its electoral activities if it wishes. So yes, Lenin advocated for socialists to utilize elections, for example in left-wing communism and infantile disorder. However, he also advocated that the majority of organizational activity involved the direct logistics of building a revolutionary organization, the direct preparation for insurrection at appropriate times. Likewise, Lenin advocated a form of labor organizing very different from the form most modern socialists undertake. This gets into the rank-and-file strategy question. Labor organizing not in the sense of building unions, but in agitating over conditions, introducing workers to revolutionary ideas, and recruiting workers to revolutionary organizations. This is almost the polar opposite from your modern Reform Caucus union strategy, which avoids discussion of revolution, but does a fairly good job building up the union movement and getting some short-term gains for workers. Now, using the Gene Sharp methodology, we can avoid armed struggle, but the fact still remains that we need a rupture, a nonviolent insurrectionism. It stands to reason that the type of activists who spend their time on reform struggles, who take themselves very seriously as they sincerely believe they are engaged in harm reduction against the system, rather than being stuck on a futile treadmill where their efforts are continually neutralized, probably won't be the ones interested in building some kind of experimental color revolution or experimental parallel government, specifically experimental socialist color revolution or experimental socialist parallel government. For that, you need people who are a little more willing to do abstract and ultra-left things, creative people, theoreticians, a little less preppy and a little more punk. You need the bad kids, so get ready to beat that punk army into discipline, because working with these types of people can be like herding cats. However, you do also need the preppies and the nerds, so everything in moderation. You need revolutionists, and revolutionists are consistently all psychotic. Less in the sense of possessing delusions, and more in the sense of being unconventional to the point of unpredictability, and often conflictual. That's an unavoidable extension of living in an irrational society, and being the type of person who has the willpower and ego to disregard their society's mainstream teachings and political conventions. Psychosis is also a natural result of the passion and disregard required to desire, advocate, and focus on the overturning of the existing social order. Obviously, this is a volatile cocktail, so the focus on nonviolent activity can help cool off or weed out some of the most erratic people. So, Lenin's position of a socialist revolution immediately after the Democratic Revolution was in many ways a position held by Trotsky, which Lenin only adopted as late as 1917. When Trotsky met Kamenev in May 1917, I'm quoting a book by Tony Cliff, Kamenev said in reply to Trotsky's words that he had no differences with Lenin. I should think not, in view of the April Theses, and Trotsky comments, not only Kamenev, but dozens of others considered Lenin's position Trotskyist and not Bolshevik at all. How you fight the system matters equally to whether you fight the system at all, because if you're chasing a dead end, you could be wasting energy on accomplishing nothing, which makes things worse by deepening demoralization. You could also be making things worse than better generally, even aside from your own wasted energy. It's possible that social democracy works, just not everywhere, and the US is one of the places it can't work anymore. It's also possible that late capitalism is in a crisis which compels all social democratic parties to preserve neoliberal austerity when in power. So in the Gospel, John 16:24, Jesus stated, "Ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete." This could be applied to regime change. Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." This includes the demand for regime change. To get the government to overthrow itself, you have to ask it to. Revolution is not disruptive mass protest without system change. Revolution is both systemic change and disruptive mass protest. You can use disruptive mass protest to demand reforms alone, but the system is unlikely to grant meaningful reforms and usually reverses them later. Therefore, even reforms require systemic change, and systemic change requires regime change. Therefore, we must forego a primary focus on economic demands alone, supplementing it with an equal focus on direct incitement of regime change. Direct organizing for regime change involves parallel government and street actions demanding regime change. There could be street actions dedicated specifically to demanding regime change primarily, effectively acting as a combined anti-government protest and rally for your parallel government. You could alternate between regime change street actions and street actions around more ordinary demands. You could also roll both into one, holding demands that involve chant slogans and speeches supporting both ordinary demands, as well as promoting a parallel government demanding regime change and calling upon the pillars to realign. The hope is that the economic struggle spontaneously leads to socialist revolution. The opposite is the case. It is sheer intentionality which causes this transition, forcing us to continually work against spontaneity, work against nature at the level of social dynamics, swimming against the stream. For example, it's true that reform struggles have won rent control in various places in various times, but at least in the USA, these victories are always followed by rollbacks. forcing the people to reorganize and re-win the same old struggles which aren't even offensive but defensive in nature. After all, the demand should really be universal housing. From the 1930s to the 1960s, the USA was arguably a social democracy. You may have painfully noticed that this is no longer the case. Social democracy can no longer return. Permanent neoliberal dictatorship will remain until capitalism is either overthrown or nearly overthrown, probably with social democratic concessions in the second scenario. We can no longer get social democracy through elections. In the USA, the New Deal was certainly a result of struggle and crisis, not just voting. We have to make an honest attempt to overthrow capitalism to even get social democracy, so we might as well go for full overthrow of capitalism, and we'll either succeed in our goal or get the consolation prize of social democracy. The key point is that we can't even get the consolation prize without going for the main goal anyway. Various groupings have formed revolutionary caucuses within DSA. Here's the problem. The social democratic critique that most revolutionary organizations simply say the word revolution a lot, then do all the same things as reformist groups, is actually true. It's not that reformism in DSA isn't a problem. The revolutionists are correct to push back against this. The problem is that there is currently no distinction between reformism and revolutionism in practice, and this should be understood as a shortcoming of all revolutionary groups and tendencies nationally and globally. So how to be, quote, actually revolutionary, end quote? It's more about concretely organizing for regime change than anything ideological or psychological. How to overthrow any government in 4 steps. This is how to be actually revolutionary. You have to start having protests to demand regime change as the main demand instead of the usual reform demands. As covered in the previous episode, the people demand removal of the regime as the slogan of the Egyptian revolution. You need to create a parallel government, self-appointed from your comrades and movement allies, to fill the power vacuum after the old government's fall and determine the politics of the aftermath. Keep using anti-government protests to persuade and pressure the pillars of power, state agencies, security forces, and media, to defect from the old government to your movement or new government. There's a little more to it. Your movement won't succeed if it doesn't have a popular main focus, and one that seems serious enough to be worth overthrowing a government. Things like democracy, socialism, and national independence seem to be the main winning causes that galvanize the masses. Ethnic conflict, religious conflict, and identity politics tend to destroy crowd revolutions from the inside rather than help them. For its role in channeling the outrage but then failing to provide a next step, Black Lives Matter is to the US movement what the Muslim Brotherhood was to the Egyptian Revolution. Also, there are steps. Tactics are small, campaigns are medium, grand strategy is big. Campaigns are ways you can group together multiple actions over time. Break things into chunks because human beings tend to think in chunks, tend to think in groups. Groups of actions, groups of objects, groups of people. If you get stuck along the way, escalating from protest to civil disobedience creates the extra friction to push you past the edge. It's a public secret of protest that nonviolent civil disobedience is the most effective way to cause mass unrest, because the physical refusal to move and the process of arrest creates deeper social division than some people throwing rocks. You don't go from an individual to a crowd revolution overnight, but you can do so over a few years. That's a startlingly faster pace of acceleration than any other strategy available. Certainly faster than guerrilla warfare, terrorism, elections, or hoping protest and labor movements will magically turn themselves into revolutions without deliberate organizing for regime change. Other strategies take decades. This strategy takes years. Regime change is hopefully an alternative to both reform-oriented progressives focused on election campaigns, as well as an alternative to edgelords trying to start a civil war by escalating violence. Regime change could be qualified as fourth-generation warfare, which runs a spectrum between political and military aspects, the line between civilian and soldier becoming blurred, the gray zone between peace and war. The tactics and methods of regime change, from nonviolent to violent, include building activist organizations, promotion, flyering, word of mouth, cultural influence like music and memes, tabling, door knocking. Nonviolent protests around reform issues, including standard protests and disruptive civil disobedience. Nonviolent protests explicitly demanding regime change as the protest's main demand. Nonviolent civil disobedience explicitly demanding regime change, which is the secret heart of regime change, built from small to mass disobedience. forming a parallel government, opposition government, revolutionary government, transitional administration, provisional government, etc., fraternizing with and encouraging the defection of security forces, government agencies, and media, riots, political graffiti, domestic coups d'etats by the military, terrorism, which this book discourages, let's not go into that, guerrilla warfare, which includes small arms skirmishes, shoulder-fired rockets and missiles, light artillery, IEDs, explosive drones, avoiding surveillance, conventional civil war involving armored vehicles and airstrikes, and foreign ground invasion with occupation airstrikes. Regime change is an interesting phrase because a lot of people associate it with when America invades someplace and takes out the old government, installs a new government. That's a foreign imposed regime change. What we're talking about is domestic regime change, which when it's done by powerful actors tends to be a coup d'etat, and when it's done by the people tends to be a crowd revolution. And of course there's all this hullabaloo about, is Gene Sharp an agent of the CIA? Are color revolutions, crowd revolutions just part of proxy wars now? Maybe. Some of them might be valid despite that because they increase democratic rights for people in countries that don't have them. But it's also true that people use these tactics and strategies. It's true that Putin's government was organizing Black Lives Matter rallies in the United States over Facebook. So it's not just America who does it, but America does definitely do it. So I think it's important to remember different things, like it wasn't some kind of proxy war when the Egyptians in 2011 were using Gene Sharp's manuals to rise against their dictatorship. That was a U.S. allied dictatorship regime. So who was doing that? It wasn't organized by Russia. It was organized by the Egyptian people. So these methods can be used by different people for different reasons. And if the system is smart enough to use these methods, then we should use them too. And if they're used by liberals who want to increase democracy, which actually I agree with, then they can also be used by socialists to fight capitalism. On that note, regime change in the West. Overthrowing a dictator is hard, but somewhat simple, because the mere act of public protest can be a huge taboo under a dictatorship. Thus, any nonviolent protest can cause escalating political conflict. If you don't have freedom of speech, and then you engage in freedom of speech, that immediately causes a big scandal. In the West, the path is less obvious. Most of our countries have achieved formal independence and democracy, as well as formal individual rights, but we still labor under the tyranny of capitalism. But whom precisely do you overthrow when you overthrow capitalism, especially when its government pretends to be democratic? That's not the only problem. The pressure to abandon revolutionary politics and collapse into election campaigns is higher in the West than anywhere. The West is home to the dominant countries of capitalism and very high levels of development. While the relative abundance of Western living is a real thing, it's still true that globalization and rising inequality have been quickly removing the Western aversion to socialism. Many countries have had various experiments with socialists running for office, largely failed in Europe and the USA, but mixed success in Latin America. The capitalist media is strongest in the most developed capitalist countries, meaning the majority must be persuaded more by struggle than direct communication, which the system owns and controls. Well, I'm talking about media, and central media heavily influences social media and public dialogue. Hell, and interpersonal dialogue, even. Yeah, it's like you talk to people and they're repeating the talking points they hear on Fox or MSNBC, and you feel like you're talking to like a robot who's programmed by the media. Anyway, sometimes you get that when you're talking to people who are influenced by various radical organizations or radical media. You can see that they're repeating the strategic talking points and doing very little original thinking. So the West also has the most highly developed formal democracies. This is another reason why, despite the obvious class rule of the wealthy over politics, people continue investing so much emotional energy, so much energy in general, on elections where the choices are between capitalism and capitalism. Lesser evil voting may make sense, but the very term lesser evil implies the main focus should be on overcoming all the evils rather than choosing between them tactically. A critical role for Western regime change activists, which is what you are, would be to polarize the conflict between democracy and capitalism, accusing capitalism of being intrinsically undemocratic, insisting that working within capitalism's electoral system is futile overall, and providing basic anti-capitalist education so people can understand how and why these things are true. So who are you overthrowing when you overthrow capitalism? There are two target components of the system, tactical and economic. The tactical considerations are the authorities who will immediately attempt to shut down your regime change, including the old government and possibly some security personnel. They should be arrested. Economically, you have to take most of the rich people's money by freezing and seizing their bank accounts and vacation homes. But more importantly, there has to be a revolution at the workplace level. The workers can spontaneously rise up and take over, or a new government can nationalize workplaces and may then grant the right of workplace democracy to the workers. Since we can't wait for spontaneity while the world is ending, this book advocates the second course of workers' councils from above. Top-down imposition of workers' councils. This would probably be a very good time to give people lots of free stuff. You overthrow the government, and now you got to build up your support base. Give people free stuff like healthcare, housing, jobs, and free money, income, to get and keep the majority on our side. At this moment, we must also place incredible focus on coordinating the economy so the standard of living grows instead of collapsing, further consolidating our majority. This will be accomplished by, not our majority, our support base, because it may be a majority and it may not be. This will be accomplished by a combination of nationalization, industrial engineering, computerized consumer data, and workplace democracy. All right, that's enough for this episode. Not trying to go too long. Not trying to make a long boy every time. I know some of my episodes have gone up to an hour or near an hour. So thank you for listening. Hopefully you understand a little more about what regime change in the Western world looks like. Hopefully, in some ways it's repeating the Russian Revolution on American soil. In some ways, it could hopefully be more democratic and nonviolent than that. But in the next episode, things will get a little spicy. I'm going to talk about how change of government is carried out in a very concrete sense. So stay tuned. We will see how do we get these obstructive politicians out of the way of the changes that we need to make. This has been World Solution Writing Process, Episode 10, signing off.